They did not study us for 340 years to find a weakness. They studied us for 340 years to finish a catalog entry they had already decided was almost complete. The Kestrel Concordance's formal induction notice arrived without warning on a Tuesday, translated by a system that rendered the phrase fully modeled client species with the same flat satisfaction a librarian uses when closing a very long file. Pursuant to Observance Directive 12, the species designated human is hereby reclassified from provisional study subject to fully modeled client species. This reclassification reflects the completion of a 340-year behavioral survey and removes the requirement for further autonomy review prior to administrative integration. Beneath it, in smaller script, the line the analysts nearly filed as routine. The concordance extends its congratulations. Few species achieve full modeling status within the first 4 centuries of contact. Observance Director Senuvar I delivered the notice in person, speaking flawless English with the warmth of a professor announcing an honor roll, standing on the steps of the United Nations building in full ceremonial dress. No weapon in sight because none had ever been necessary. He explained, with what he clearly believed was genuine congratulation, that the reclassification was not a punishment but an achievement, that humanity's behavior had been modeled to a confidence interval no other species had reached this early, and that the accompanying administrative integration, effective in 36 hours, was simply the natural next step for a species the concordance now understood completely. He smiled through all of it, the way a teacher smiles handing back a test the student was never meant to see the grading key for. There was a long silence in the emergency assembly hall after his shuttle lifted off. It lasted the better part of a minute, which is a long time to sit in a room full of diplomats who have just been told cheerfully that they have been fully solved. Dr. Renata Cole broke it. She had spent the entire address standing near a side door, not because she had missed the insult, but because she had recognized something in the phrase behavioral survey that she suspected nobody else in the room had caught. "I want their published confidence intervals," she said. "Every category they claim to have modeled. Tonight, if anyone can get them released." Renata Cole was not a diplomat, and she had spent her entire career trying not to be treated like one. She was a socio-technical anthropologist who had spent 15 years arguing, to a shrinking list of research funders, that informal human networks, the improvised, unranked, self-organizing kind that formed around hobbies rather than institutions, carried a form of resilience that formal modeling consistently failed to capture, because formal modeling only measures what it already expects to find. She had kept every one of those rejected grant applications, printed and highlighted, in a folder she had started calling, with no particular affection, the drawer. She had spent 15 years arguing that any species trying to model humanity from its governments and militaries alone was measuring the wrong layer entirely. What she found in the released confidence intervals, read that night by lamplight with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, was this. The Concordance's 340-year survey had achieved near-perfect modeling confidence across every formal human system, governments, corporations, militaries, infrastructure, and had flagged one recurring category of activity, appearing in every dataset since the earliest radio-era observation logs, as low-signal informal noise, non-predictive, excluded from primary modeling. The excluded category was amateur radio. "They modeled every government we've ever had," she said. "They never modeled the people who talk to each other for no reason at all. I want to know what that actually adds up to before we run out of hours to ask." It did not sound like the beginning of a resistance movement. It sounded, to the 2 aides who wrote it down afterward, like a woman quietly noticing a gap in someone else's homework. It was, in fact, both. Marcus Oyelaran had spent 11 years pitching to an increasingly unreceptive string of defense contractors, a redundant human relay network built from amateur radio operators as emergency backup communications. An idea one procurement board had rejected in writing as solving a resilience problem that does not currently exist. He did not need convincing now. He was already pulling up his old relay maps by the time Cole finished her sentence, because he had spent 11 years hoping someone would eventually need them. There are an estimated 3 million licensed amateur operators worldwide, he said, running on frequencies the Concordance's own confidence intervals list as unmodeled. No central node, no fixed hierarchy. Nothing that behaves like the systems they've spent 3 centuries learning to predict. He did not look up from his maps. I can activate a coordination mesh through this network inside a day. I cannot promise the Concordance stays blind to it once we start using it for something that matters. Then we have until they notice to find out what it's actually good for, Cole said. Dr. Beatrice Fonts had spent 6 years quietly analyzing leaked fragments of the Concordance's own observance methodology, an academic sideline her department had described in a formal review as of limited operational relevance. She was the one who explained, once Euler's mesh was live, exactly why the exclusion mattered as much as it did. Their models don't just miss amateur radio, she said, cross-referencing the leaked methodology against 3 centuries of exclusion flags. They're built to filter out any human coordination that doesn't map onto a role, a rank, or a chain of command, because every other species they've cataloged organizes that way by default. We're the first one that also organizes the other way, informally, for fun, and their own documentation calls it noise in writing. She looked up. If we coordinate through this mesh instead of anything they've ever modeled, we are not hiding from a blind spot. We are the first species to actually stand inside one. It took the Concordance 19 hours to notice, a number that mattered because it left 17 hours before the induction deadline, rather than the full 36 anyone had expected to work with. Senuvar I's response arrived within minutes of detection, still formally polite. Unregistered coordination activity across unmodeled frequency bands constituted a procedural irregularity inconsistent with a fully modeled client species, and Earth had until the original induction deadline to cease all such activity or face what he termed administrative correction of non-compliant infrastructure, a phrase Cole did not need translated twice. She read the notice once, standing in the same assembly hall where the induction had first been announced. 17 hours, she said. Fonts, is there a procedural challenge buried in their own regulations we can actually file before that clock runs out? There's a species petition clause in the original contact treaty. Nobody's invoked it in 200 years because nobody's had grounds the Concordance would have to formally acknowledge. Then we have 17 hours to give them grounds. The Concordance's correction drones deployed at hour 14, 11 units tasked with disabling registered amateur relay towers across 6 continents, each drone requiring approximately 4 minutes to locate, confirm, and disable a single charted site. Euler's mesh, built from operators who had spent decades treating redundancy as a hobby rather than a doctrine, rerouted around each disabled tower within the same window, activating unregistered backup nodes, car-mounted rigs, and improvised antenna arrays that existed on no concordance chart, because they had never been built to a specification any one official had approved. 41 such nodes came online in the first 11 minutes alone, more than the drone's tasking software had allocated targets for. One drone adapted mid-mission, redirecting from a disabled tower toward the strongest new signal instead of its assigned target. It located Euler's own relay in under 90 seconds, faster than his mesh had planned for. Fonts called the adjustment herself, not a counterattack, a diffusion. Euler's mesh, at her direction, split the strongest signal into 4 weaker ones across 4 separate unregistered nodes the instant the drone showed interest. A maneuver amateur radio operators call splitting the net, and had never once needed for anything more serious than avoiding interference during a contest weekend. The drone held position between 4 equally weak signals for 6 seconds before its tasking software timed out and reassigned it to a new charted target, because nothing in its model accounted for a network that would rather blur its own signal than protect a single node. By hour 16, all 11 registered towers were offline. The mesh was carrying more total traffic than before the drones deployed. Fonts transmitted humanity's formal species petition, the procedural challenge buried for 2 centuries in the original contact treaty, through the mesh itself, 40 minutes before the deadline. Using an unregistered node the Concordance's own drones had already checked and dismissed as insufficiently active to matter. The correction order, queued and ready to escalate to full infrastructure suppression, did not fire. A formal species petition, once transmitted through any channel the Concordance's own treaty recognized as valid, legally froze all enforcement action pending review, a clause nobody had invoked in 2 centuries because nobody had ever managed to file one before the enforcement clock ran out. "Let the drones sit there," Cole said, watching the standoff from the coordination center. "We didn't need to beat their correction fleet. We needed our own petition filed before they finished correcting us, and now they have to explain on the record why they never modeled the network that filed it." Senuvar I's official communication arrived 4 hours later, formally worded, acknowledging an unresolved procedural filing requiring full committee review, and postponing all administrative integration pending that review's conclusion. The second transmission arrived 3 minutes after the first, on a channel his own protocols should not have permitted for personal contact. There was a long pause before he spoke. "I misjudged one specific thing," he said. "Not your capability. We model capability in every species we survey in the abstract. I misjudged what you would build for no reason at all across 3 centuries, simply because doing so felt worth doing." A shorter pause. It was audacious, filing a 200-year-old petition through a network our own documentation swore had nothing worth watching. I did not expect that. I doubt the Observance Division expected it either, whatever language they use in the coming review. But he did not apologize, not in those exact words. It was close enough that the Assembly Hall, replaying the transcript that night, agreed it counted. Cole was back at her desk 9 hours after the standoff, not resting, cross-referencing Font's leaked methodology against 3 centuries of exclusion flags, with the same flat attention she had given the first rejected grant application 15 years earlier. "I've been thinking about the other exclusion categories since about hour 3, she said, not looking up. "If the committee review reopens our classification, I wanted to include full access to their own filtered noise archive, not just an apology for missing ham radio. We found one blind spot ourselves, in 19 hours, using nothing but hobbyists and a 200-year-old treaty clause. I want to know how many other species are sitting inside a blind spot of their own, waiting for someone to notice the noise." Oyalaran asked if she was already drafting that request. She was.